verse 5, we ended our lesson talking about slavery, slaves and servants. And so this passage in Nehemiah was very fitting, but two verses stood out. Nehemiah 5:5 and verse 10. So here is verse 5, which reads, "Yet now our flesh is the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards." Now, this word slaves, we've gone over this Hebrew word. It can mean servant. It can mean slave, bondservant, manservant. So in this sense, the words can be synonymous, but the best thing that we can do is allow the context to define the word for us. And so clearly, we're going to notice a difference between a word used in verse 10 and this word slaves in verse 5. Now, this next word, slavery, means to subdue, means to bring into subjection, means to keep under. And we see this same word in Genesis 1:28, when God tells mankind to subdue his creation, to bring under, to keep into bondage. In other words, creation will know when you operate in this dominion that they are submitted to you as you are submitted to me, said God in Genesis 1:26 through 28. So this word slavery can also mean subdue. It can mean dominate. It can mean force, tread down, bring into bondage. Clearly in this context, it's referring to slaves, slavery, bondage, servitude, forcing. This word servant in verse 10, however, is slightly different. Verse 10 reads, "I also with my brethren and my servants." This is Nehemiah speaking. And he says that he has servants. "With his brethren and his servants am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury." We see this word servants here in the scripture. And this word servant, na'ar, is the Hebrew word. And it does not mean the same thing that the word slaves means in verse 5, although that Hebrew word can refer to servants. But this is a different Hebrew word, and it refers to a young man. It can refer to a young child. It can refer to one who is retained. So in this context, this is someone that will receive compensation for their job performance. So that is what Nehemiah was referring to when he mentioned servants in verse 10. Of course, in verse 5, when he mentions slaves and he mentions slavery, he is talking about bondage and bringing into subjection. Let's look at Genesis 44. This is another place in Scripture that we see the word used. Genesis 44, and find verse 33. You all recall Joseph was sold into Egyptian bondage. He was sold into slavery. And of course, because God was with him and favor found him, then he flourished where he was, and he assumed the second highest position in all the land. And so here we are moving a couple chapters ahead of that time in which he was sold into slavery. He is encountering his brothers. They do not realize who they are standing in front of. And then his 33rd verse, this is regarding Benjamin, Judah interceding for Benjamin. Genesis 44:33 reads, "Now therefore please let your servant remain." We see the word servant here. It says, "Instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers." Once again, Joseph's brothers standing before him, Judah interceding for Benjamin. And in this 33rd verse, we see the word servant as well as the word slave. So this word servant is actually the same word that we read in Nehemiah 5:5, where we read about the slaves. And then also this word slave, same verse, means the same thing. Yet if you notice, just by the context, that there is a distinction between the word servant and slave in this particular verse. So even though the Hebrew word may be the same, the context will define exactly what is being discussed. Now, transatlantic slavery. Let's drop a few nuggets and then get into some more scriptures. Now, we're familiar with this. We learned a little bit about it in high school. We've seen movies, we've seen Roots, we've seen television shows, we've seen documentaries, specials, etc. But there's still so much that we can learn from this unfortunate time in human history. Now, the vast majority of those who were enslaved and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa. Makes sense. West Africa, right there on the coast, by the water. The ships could get there much easier. People from Central and West Africa who had been, and some of you know this, this may be new for some of you, who had been sold by other West Africans. They'd been sold by other West Africans or by half European merchant princes to Western European slave traders, with a small number being captured directly by the slave traders in coastal raids who brought them to the Americas. The 6 major European Atlantic slave trading nations ordered by trade volume were the Portuguese, the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish. European. See, the Spanish were Europeans. The fact that Mexicans, the fact that other South American nations speak Spanish has nothing to do with them being Spanish, because they're not. They're the indigenous people of Central and South America. But as you can see, one of the 6 major slave trading nations was Spain. And how did Spanish get over to this side of the world? Well, because of a European nation named Spain bringing slaves over. Several of these nations had established outposts on the African coast where they purchased slaves from local African leaders. Africans played a direct role in the slave trade, kidnapping adults and stealing children for the purpose of selling them through intermediaries to Europeans or European agents. Those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group than those who captured them, whether enemies or just neighbors. I want to read that one more time. Those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group. A different ethnic group. Now, we've been having a very intense, detailed, and lengthy discussion as to whether a particular scripture in Deuteronomy 28, 68th verse in particular, could be referring to those during the transatlantic slave trade. Because so many of the descriptions in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy fit what occurred in the 1600s, right? Well into the 1850s. But of course, many of those other descriptions in Deuteronomy 28 refer to slavery in general, and other nations of antiquity were also doing those same things. It's just that 68th verse was a bit of a standout verse because it mentioned ships. And so there's a running theory, and many proponents who believe that that's referring to the transatlantic slave trade by which Jews were brought from West Africa to the Americas. Now, here are the facts once again. After Assyrian captivity, at some point, the 10 tribes went south, making their way southwest, making their way to North Africa, taking up residence in North Africa, and from North Africa, some would eventually migrate to West Africa. Now, in Nigeria land, there was a particular tribe, the Igbo, and there has been and are a number of Igbo who are Jews. All right, one question was, were all the Igbo Jews? Second question was, amongst the Igbo, was there a microcosm that were Jews? Reading the work of Olaudah Equiano, mentioning this slave who was born Igbo, eventually became freed, eventually became educated. He made some interesting observations that some of the practices of the Ibu tribe were very similar to the practices found in Israel. Now, did that automatically mean that all of Ibu or all of the Ibu were Jews, Israelites? Not necessarily, because there is another explanation, and we went over that, Olaudah conferring with the theologian John Gill as to how Abraham and his African wife, who went by the name of Keturah, and come to find out, Keturah is believed to have been from Saudi Arabia, yet she's referred to as his African wife. And they had a son, Midian, and Midian had a son, Epher, and from Epher, who eventually would go and wage war with the nations, the territories of Libya. And it would seem then that by way of Epher, by way of Midian, of course, by way of Abraham and Keturah, that Abraham could have easily fathered the remaining portions of Africa. So West Africa, Central and South Africa, because Ham did not father all of Africa. He only fathered Northern Africa. So that would include Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia, but Libya in particular. Of course, Mizraim would father Egypt and Cush, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. So that's North Africa, Northeast Africa, and then Canaan, which would be the Levant, a portion of the Fertile Crescent. Now, let me take a brief little detour. Wife and I were watching a movie Friday night. We were watching a Regina King film, One Night in Miami, on Amazon Prime. And One Night in Miami was a story. What an amazing director she is. What an amazing movie, because the majority of the movie is spent in a hotel room and you're captivated the entire time. There are 4 iconic figures in this hotel room. You had Jim Brown, notable football player. He was militant as well. You had Malcolm X, of course. You had Muhammad Ali, and you had, say it again. Sam Cooke. How did I forget his name that quickly? And you had Sam Cooke. So you had Sam Cooke, Jim Brown, Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali. There's a scene in the movie where they go up to the roof of the motel. And Malcolm begins to talk about how he's going to take a trip, his Mecca. Because, of course, at least once in every Muslim's life, they should take a trip to Mecca and Medina. So he was talking about this trip, Mecca. And so Sam Cooke responds, "Whoa, you're going to Saudi Arabia?" And then Malcolm says, "Yes." And he asks Muhammad, "Do you want to go?" And Muhammad says, "Sure, why not?" And then they look at Jim and ask Jim, "Do you want to go?" And this was Jim Brown's response. I found it very interesting. Jim said, "Yeah, I'd love to go see," I'm paraphrasing, "I'd love to go see the African women or the African ladies." Now, why is it that this movie, created recently, a period piece based on true events, why is it that in this film, after Malcolm mentions Saudi Arabia, Jim Brown calls it Africa? How is it that noted theologian John Gill refers to Abraham's third wife as an African woman when she came from Saudi Arabia? Now, if you look up where Saudi Arabia is today, you'll most likely be told that it's West Asia. But there are many opponents of that who would argue that Saudi Arabia is actually just Eastern Africa. And what's so interesting about this, we've gone over this in the Table of Nations, looking at both Shem and Ham, how they both have a Sheba, how they both have a Havilah, how it's just the Red Sea that separates Ethiopia and Arabia, and a Midian in northwest Arabia is known as Kashan, and Ethiopia is known as Cush, and they were both dark-skinned. What are the odds of that? That's definitely not accidental. I believe the argument for Saudi Arabia being Africa is very strong. So, going back to Olaudah Equiano, who was making the observation that he, as an Ibu man, had practices and traditions and rituals that were very similar to Israel. It could have easily meant that, yes, indeed, all of the Ibu were Jews, or could have also meant that because of that union between Abraham and Keturah, which produced West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and other nations included, that's the reason why some of the practices were similar to Israel. Not all, but some. With that being said, is it possible? We also threw this possibility out there. Could we consider that maybe, just maybe, because, as it says here, those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group. All right, we've got some similar skin complexion here, but you're not of my tribe. And so some from certain tribes sold others from other tribes. Is it possible that West Africans sold West African Jews because of some slight distinctions? And maybe the West Africans had the advantage. Here's what we know for a fact. All right, a lot of these are theories, but here's what we know for a fact. What's not a theory is that there were Jews in North Africa, and then Jews made their way to West Africa before the slave trade began, which, in my humble opinion, it would seem that if West African Jews were already there before the slave trade began, then quite easily many West African Jews could have been included in the number of Africans shipped across the Atlantic. These captive slaves were considered other, not part of the people of the ethnic group or tribe. African kings were only interested in protecting their own ethnic group, but sometimes criminals would be sold to get rid of them. They were considered less than. Most other slaves were obtained from kidnappings or through raids that occurred at gunpoint through joint ventures with the Europeans. But some African kings refused to sell any of their captives or criminals. The Atlantic slave trade was the result of, among other things, labor shortage. Itself, in turn, created by the desire of European colonists to exploit New World land and resources for capital profits. The indigenous people of the Americas were first utilized as slave labor by Europeans until a large number died from overwork and old world diseases. Current estimates are that about 12 million to 12.8 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic over a span of 400 years. 12 million to 12.8 million. It's believed that maybe 2.5 million died before they made it over to the Americas. And then, of course, from those that made it over, possibly another 50 plus million. Most likely more, because it's believed that maybe 50 million Africans or those of West African descent died during that 400-year span. So if 50 million died, there had to be more than that. The Honorable Eric Williams, who was known as the father of the nation of Trinidad and Tobago, having led them to majority rule on October 28, 1956, then to independence from Britain on August 31st, 1962, and into republicanism on August 1st, 1976, and was the first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago, was quoted having said, this is a quote from Eric Williams. You can research Eric Williams on your own. He was quoted having said, "A racial twist was given to what is basically an economic phenomenon." How many of you recall Apostle Price talking about this during Race, Religion, and Racism 24 years ago, saying that racism was about what? Economics. Eric Williams says a racial twist was given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. I thought what he says next was so fitting. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. And that's very valid. Why? Because slavery has been around for a long time. It's an old world practice, back to antiquity. But nations didn't enslave nations because of racism. Oh no, because if it was because of racism, then there would have been certain groups that would not have been enslaved because of similar skin complexion. But that was not it. It was about kingdoms and empires. So once again, Eric Williams says, slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. The belief that Caucasian Europeans were divinely ordained by an omnipotent Judeo-Christian God as superior to other human races with darker skin, a major tenet of the white supremacy movement, was one of the misperceptions that would allow industrial-scale slavery across the Atlantic to thrive. And where did this supposed divine ordination originate? From a perversion of the scriptures. So let's revisit Genesis 9, verse 18, if you all don't mind. Genesis 9, verse 18. Once again, I reference the book of Eli with Denzel Washington. And in this movie, played by Gary Oldman, the antagonist, Carnegie, who was hell-bent on retrieving this book. And what book was that? It was the Bible. And why did he want it? Because he knew of its power, and he knew how he could use that book and lord over his town and spread his rule. He wanted to take that book and pervert it the same way Caucasian Europeans took this book and perverted the scriptures to authorize slavery. Genesis 9:18. It says, now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. There are some that read this verse and say, well, Noah had other sons on the ark, and they remained on the ark. And what this verse is simply highlighting are the ones that came off. That does not seem to be accurate. But you can see how someone can come up with a theory based on the way a verse is written. But there is no biblical record of any other sons outside of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The next verse is going to pretty much confirm this. It reads next that Ham was the father of Canaan. Why does that get mentioned? We'll see in just a moment. Most of you already know. Verse 19. These three were the what? The who? The sons of Noah. And from these, a little piece of the earth was populated. No? Half the earth was populated. No? Not a little piece, not half, not 3/4. No. It says, from these three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the whole earth was populated. So you're a Semite, a Hamite, or a Japhethite. One of the three. As I jokingly say, 1/3 of the earth's population, brothers and sisters. The other 2/3, those are your cousins. Verse 20. It says, and Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. And then he drank of the wine, and, well, he had a bit too much. He was given to it. And he was drunk, and he became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, why do you keep bringing Canaan up? Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and instead of covering up his father, he runs out and he tells his two brothers. Now, there are numerous theories as to what this nakedness could have referred to. Number one, he saw his father naked. In an embarrassing and drunken state, which was dishonorable. Number two, he knew his father carnally. Number three, he knew his mother carnally, because according to Leviticus, the wife is the father's nakedness. One of the three. Whichever it was harmful. So verse 23 says, Shem and Japheth took a garment, they laid it on both their shoulders, and they went backward. They understood that it was about honoring their father. They went backward, they covered the nakedness of their father, their faces were turned away, and they didn't see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his drunken stupor, from his wine, and knew what his, interestingly, it's worded younger son, but most likely Ham was the youngest. So he knew what his younger son had done to him. This word younger can also mean youngest or the least in the Hebrew. He knew what his younger son had done to him. And what's the first thing he says out of this drunken stupor? Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. And what does he say next? Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Is he not the God of Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Why the God of Shem? This would point to the fact that the chosen elect would come from Shem. It says, and may Canaan be his servant. Whose servant? Shem's servant. May God enlarge Japheth, where Europe comes from, and may he, Japheth, dwell in the tents of his brother Shem, and may Canaan be Japheth's servant also. Now, what can we walk away from reading this? How can we twist this to our advantage? How can we pervert this? Well, look, it says right here that that Canaan would be the servant of Japheth, and didn't the black folk come from Ham? And Canaan came from Ham. So if black folk came from Ham, Canaan specifically comes from Ham, then Canaan had to be black like his daddy, and because of Ham's indiscretion, Canaan's cursed to be a servant to the seed of Japheth. There it is. There's Africa submitting to Europe out of the mouth of Noah himself. But wait a minute. We didn't do enough research. And when you don't do enough research and you just prove text, then you can create doctrine. And if the Holy Spirit is absent, you're in a lot of trouble. Let's go over this. Back to verse 25, briefly. Then he said, cursed be Canaan. Okay, so the first thing that comes out of Noah's mouth, there is no record here that the Lord inspired Noah to curse Canaan, or that the Lord gave Noah the words or this curse to be upon Canaan. Just said, cursed be Canaan. Curse one of your 4 sons, Ham, for what you've done. Notice what it says next. A servant of servants. I mean, wouldn't it be bad enough to say, a servant he shall be to his brethren? But rather, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. If we want to turn this word into slave, it would read like this, a slave of slaves. Imagine you're a slave and your master is not a freedman. Your master's a slave of slaves. So that slave reports to his master, and you, the slave, report to a slave. A servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. Well, wait a minute now. Brethren? Brothers? Are we talking about brothers? Well, Canaan only had 3 brothers. If we're just defining words here. Or if we're just looking at the surface of words. I mean, if Canaan's going to be a servant of servants, and a servant of servants he shall be to his brother, and it sounds to me like he's going to be a servant of servants to Mizraim, Put, and Cush. So Canaan should be a servant of servants to Libya, North Africa, Egypt, and the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, the Nubian kingdom of Cush. Oh, but wait, maybe we should define the word brethren in the Hebrew and then see, it's not limited to brothers, but also kindred or relatives. Oh, okay, that expands it. So that would include some cousins maybe. And the cousins could come from all over the place as far as Japheth, Ham, and Shem are concerned. Okay, all right. Verse 26 says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May Canaan be the servant of Shem. May the son of Ham be the servant of the father of the Semites. A Hamite submitted to a Semite. That's what this wording would imply. And then the next verse says, may God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem. So Japheth would live or dwell in the territory of Shem, and while doing that, also have Canaan as his servant. So technically, if this means that black people were supposed to be and ordained of God, slaves to white people, well, shouldn't these black people also have been slaves in the same manner to brown-skinned people? Because Shem produced, brown skin. He produced some light skin, close to white skin, some yellow skin, as well as some black skinned peoples. I mean, this basically says that Cain is going to be a servant to both Shem and Japheth. So how could that be used to justify transatlantic slave movement? Also, when Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan," what was that curse? There's nothing in Scripture that seems to tell us what that curse is. But when you look at the behavior of Canaan and the Canaanites moving forward in Scripture, you can see an esteem. You can see a behavior that speaks of one who is low. And I wholeheartedly believe that what Noah did out of his drunkenness was he cursed Canaan low. Cursed him low, meaning what? He took out of Canaan his confidence and his identity. And Canaan actually means the lowland, the lowland. It is quite possible that since faith comes by hearing, and that hasn't changed since creation has began, Canaan heard what Grandpa said, and I'm going to be honest with you. If we love our grandpas and our grandpas curse us, we're going to feel some type of way. That's the reality of it. The bottom line is that there's nothing here that can support Europe enslaving Africa. Because I'm going to do you one better. And I mentioned this to you 2 weeks ago. The Zondervan Compact Study Bible. Zondervan Compact Study Bible, which was not put together by black people. Their commentary, their note on the Table of Nations, they don't elaborate on it, they don't expound on it, but they say it, and it's obvious they say it for a reason, and I believe part of that reason is because of the works of scholars like John Gill and others. But the Zondervan Compact Study Bible says that Ham is the father of North Africa, not the Negroes. Where would they get that from? Why would they write that? And for everyone to see in their study Bible that Ham's not the father of the Negroes, the father of the darker skinned peoples, North Africa, but not the Negroes. If that's the case, where did the Negroes come from? They didn't come from Japheth. That only leaves one other option. And those of West Africa, those taken from West Africa, brought over to this nation, were the Negroes. And based on John Gill's study, as well as others, but him being the most notable one, with Abraham by way of Keturah fathering the remaining portions of Africa that would then make West Africans Semitic and would explain why the Zondervan Compact Study Bible says that the Negroes didn't come from Ham, rather they came from Shem. That's an eye-opener. So with that being the case, that dispels this lie right here. Because Canaan didn't come from Shem, Canaan came from Ham. Now Canaanites became Semitic-speaking peoples, and a Semitic nation took over that land. But their origin, Ham. So this doesn't fly. And, once again, the transatlantic slave trade happened after Christ's work at Calvary, by which Christ redeemed Israel from the curse of the law and the rest of the Gentiles from the curse that was in the world as a result of Adam's sin. So anyone cursed before Christ, after having entered Christ, is no longer cursed. Christ does away with the curse. The curse can no longer lord itself over you if you're in Christ. If you belong to Christ, you're not cursed. You can't be cursed. You're blessed, and there's nothing the devil can do about it. So this is not flying. Let's see what else we have. Go to Exodus 21. Because once again, like Carnegie said, I know of its power. Oh, if I could take this book and make sure no one else reads it, ooh, the things I can do. Exodus 21. We're going to get into the early parts of the law now, which you interestingly have some who claim to be believers in Messiah, but believe you're obligated to work the law, which of course we know they're failing epically because they're not keeping all of the law. Right after the Ten Commandments, it's interesting. The first law we see is the law of the altar, on which you make your offerings, your peace offerings, on a particular altar. Who's doing that, I wonder? And then immediately after that, it's the law concerning servants, here in Exodus 21. 10 Commandments, Exodus 20. Later on in the 20th chapter of Exodus, the law of the altar, here we are, Exodus 21. Next thing we see is the law concerning servants. This is for Israel. And this is what was said here in this first verse. Exodus 21:1. We're going to look at these scriptures because these are the scriptures that were perverted and taken completely out of context, believing that God authorized slavery as if it was his ordained will. And unfortunately, many believers, even those who call themselves educated in the scriptures, don't know how to read the scriptures. Exodus 21:1. Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, that's a human for purchase. Can you imagine being sold? You buy a house, you buy a car, you buy a meal. A human? Now look, once again, this is the law concerning servants, but also notice the first word of verse 2, if. That's an important word. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. Sounds like the Sabbath year of his term. Verse 3. If he, the Hebrew servant that you bought, comes in by himself, well, he'll go out by himself. If he comes in married, he shall go out by himself. I'm sorry, if he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. All right, so let's read that third verse again. If he comes in by himself, he's going to go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and the children shall belong to the master, but he'll go out by himself. This is the law concerning servants to Israel. We saw this same thing implemented during the 1600s. While a slave, he gets a wife and has kids, but when he's free, wife and kids aren't. If he can go out, his wife and kids can't because they belong to the master. That was borrowed from the book of Exodus and justified because it appears God's okay with it. But they just butchered the context. That's what they did. And if you're ignorant and you don't know the word or you can't read, I'm the king. Verse 5. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. Watch this. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he'll serve him forever. That piercing meant you were owned. You were property forever. Verse 7. And if a man sells his daughter, let's just take a moment. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without paying money. This was the law concerning servants. As you can see, slaves In this context, servants and slaves are the same. This was the law concerning them. For who? For Israel. But I want you to notice that there's nothing in these 11th verses by which we read that God said, thou shalt and thou must do this. Notice verse 2, if you buy. Now we'll get to why a Hebrew might buy a Hebrew. We'll get to that later. But notice that word, if. What was God saying? If this happens, then these are the rules for you, Israel, which makes you distinct from the rules of other nations, or your rules are distinct from the rules of other nations, which makes you, Israel, distinct from other nations. Now let's keep reading. Look at Deuteronomy 15:12. Deuteronomy 15:12. And we're going to read some things similar, but then some things are a little bit different. Deuteronomy 15:12. Look at how this verse opens up. If. It also begins with the if, but remember Exodus 21:2 read, if you buy a Hebrew servant. Deuteronomy 15:12 begins with this, if your brother. That carries a little more weight. When you read it, when you read Deuteronomy as opposed to Exodus, it opens up with if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And look at what it says. Look at what it says next. See, this is what made Israel distinct from everyone else. Is this God saying you must have slaves and servants? No. He said if you have them. And why might they have them? Because the institution of slavery already existed before Israel. It was in the earth. And this carries all the way through to the New Testament. We read scriptures about servants and masters, and it might appear that God was saying it was okay to do it, but that's not what God was saying. God was giving rules to his people regarding something that already existed, a practice that was already in operation. If that practice that existed before I chose you, elect Israel, and that practice makes its way into your midst, then these are my rules for it if you do it. Not thou shalt and thou must do it. Because if he was for slavery, there would be no point in God offering freedom later. God didn't authorize Adam to sin. Adam sinned, and we became slaves to sin. That's where slavery began. Deuteronomy 15. Look at verse 13. It says, in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you, and when you send him away from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. I don't think the Europeans got this part. Because I think we're all missing 40 acres and a mule. So you see how you can pick and choose the parts of scriptures you like. You leave out the parts that are not a convenience to you. If you claim it's the Bible that authorizes your slavery, you got to do it the way it's written in the Bible. This little piece was conveniently missing, wasn't it? Verse 13, when you send him away from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. Verse 14, look at this. You shall supply him liberally. And folk get mad at black people for talking about reparations in 2021. Because I'm sorry, we're still at a disadvantage. In this nation, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Are we better than where we were before? Sure. Yeah, sure we are. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. That's a whole lot. from what the Lord your God has blessed you with, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. And if it happens that he says to you, I will not go away from you, because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you. This ain't really sounding too much like slavery. Now it sounds like we're getting into servitude or the position of hired servant. Because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you. Then verse 17. This time the piercing doesn't sound as bad. The way we read it in Exodus 21, verse 17. Then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear to the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also to your female servant you shall do likewise. It shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant and serving you 6 years. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. What are we reading? We're reading the law given to Israel concerning servants. If you, Exodus 21:2, if you, Deuteronomy 15:12, if you're going to have a servant, here's how you have a servant. Let's keep going, since you guys asked me to. You're in Deuteronomy. Look at chapter 23. Chapter 23, Deuteronomy 23. Look at 2 verses quickly. These 2 verses, 15 and 16 of Deuteronomy 23, were categorized under miscellaneous laws. Verse 15 says, Deuteronomy 23, you shall not give back to his master. Now pay attention to this, because you also saw a bit of this during transatlantic slavery as well. Between 1611 and the Emancipation Proclamation as well. You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. Slave is under a master, he escapes, he comes to you. This law says you shall not give back to his master the slave who's come to you. Verse 16, he may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses, within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him. Oh yeah, we missed that part too, didn't we? Didn't we? Six European nations who brought slaves over, Britain in particular, bringing West Africans over to what would become the United States of America. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses. This is... I mean, the word used here is slave, which same Hebrew word can mean servant. But man, in this context, it's not sounding too harsh. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses, within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him. So we have the audacity, and I'm saying we, even though I wasn't one of the we. Neither were my ancestors. My ancestors were slaves. If you're black in America, your ancestors were slaves. Not if you on your own will and power in recent years left your home nation to come to America. No, if your ancestors were brought over as slaves, then your ancestors were slaves. And the slave masters seem to have missed verse 16 as well. That one also was not convenient, wasn't conducive. Leviticus 25. Look at verse 39. Leviticus 25. Verse 39. It says, and if one of your brethren who dwells, I mean, is it me or is this the third time I'm seeing the word if? And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor, and he sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. As a hired servant. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves, listen.